Today, I'm issuing a revision to the 2022-23 Biennial Revenue Estimate. As I have cautioned for more than a year and emphasized when I released the BRE in January, we've dealt with an unprecedented amount of economic uncertainty since the start of the pandemic. For that reason, I assured state leaders and lawmakers in January that we would revise the BRE if conditions warranted. When we finalized our economic forecast for the January BRE, COVID case counts and hospitalizations were on the rise, and the rollout of vaccines had just begun. Those conditions warranted caution about the near-term economic outlook. Since then, case counts and hospitalizations have plummeted, many restrictions have been lifted, and the economic activity in the state and across the country has accelerated. April's tax collections were up sharply from a year ago, and we should expect large year-over-year increases to continue in the coming months thanks to severely suppressed collections a year ago attributed to the pandemic. Some of April's increase is likely attributable to the federal stimulus funds in the form of direct payments to individuals, as well as the renewed enhanced unemployment benefits, which are currently set to expire in September. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that economic activity has picked up in Texas, and I'm revising upward my forecast of revenue available for general purpose spending by the 87th legislature. The details of our revised estimates for both the 2020-21 and 2022-23 biennium are on this slide. Revisions to estimated revenue collections in the current fiscal year, along with revised projections of general revenue obligations for the Foundation School Program, mean we now project a positive ending balance for the 22-21 biennium of $725 million, a substantial improvement from the $946 million shortfall we projected in January. That improvement, combined with higher projected revenue collections in 2022-23, result in a $115.65 billion available for 22-23 biennium, an increase of $3.12 billion from the January BRE. Some of the increased revenue projection is attributed to higher estimates of oil and natural gas production tax collections. These affect not only the money available for general purpose spending, but the state's highway and economic stabilization funds, which receive a portion of oil and gas tax revenues. Consequently, I now expect to transfer $1.26 billion to each of these funds in fiscal 2022 and another $1.67 billion in fiscal 2023, not counting any appropriations from the Economic Stabilization Fund by the 87th legislature. I now expect its balance to be $12.12 billion at the end of the 2022-23 biennium. As with my January estimate, this revision does not include any savings from agency budget reductions, nor does it include other adjustments included in House Bill 2, the supplemental appropriations bill recently approved by the House. We will certify any savings if and when that legislation is approved by both chambers of the legislature, including federal funds and constitutionally dedicated funds that can only be spent for designated purposes. We are projecting nearly $294 billion in all funds revenue for the 2022-23 biennium. The all funds estimate is significantly higher than we projected in the January BRE. This is partly attributable to a substantial increase in estimated federal funds due to the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. This slide includes some highlights from that legislation. Note, however, that none of this revenue is included in our projection of revenue available for general purpose spending. Depending on further federal guidance and appropriation discussions by the legislature and governor, it is possible that some of this money could be used for general purpose spending. Texas and many other states have continued to benefit from our ability to collect taxes from out-of-state online retailers. This slide simply updates information from our January BRE showing monthly collections from remote sellers and online providers. Those remittances reached a record high in January thanks to robust online sales during the December holiday season, and they remain elevated from pre-pandemic levels. As I mentioned earlier, vaccine administration has risen substantially from where it was when we released our BRE, and Texas case counts have fallen sharply. This has contributed to stronger economic growth projections. Texas, however, is very tied to the global economy, and it's important to note that case counts around the world are rising, with some nations being hit very hard in recent weeks. If this resurgence in cases slows global economic growth, it could also be a drag on our economy. As always, our forecasts must grapple with the inherent uncertainty in oil and gas prices, as that industry is still a significant contributor to the Texas economy and state revenues. Oil prices are up from last year, and rig count has been steadily increasing for months. And so we have increased our forecast of oil and natural gas tax revenues, but those revenues remain highly volatile and difficult to predict. I will close by noting that while our current outlook is more optimistic, and the economic environment is much better than almost anyone expected a year ago, the pandemic has caused a lot of damage. It will take Texas' economy some time to return to pre-pandemic conditions and even longer to return to where we would have been if pre-pandemic growth trends had continued through 2020. Texas employment peaked in February of 2020. Then the state lost more than 1.4 million jobs in just 2 months. Job growth rebounded sharply starting in May, but as of March this year, Texas still had nearly 470,000 fewer jobs than in February of 2020. Despite an unemployment rate of 6.9%, many employers have recently commented that they are having difficulty filling positions needed to meet increasing consumer demand, and some have cited the recent stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits as contributing factors. In the near term, a lack of labor could be a small drag on growth and could particularly affect the service businesses that were hit hardest by the pandemic. Our revised revenue forecast assumes continued economic growth through the next biennium, but uncertainty remains as to the ultimate course of the economy and thus state revenues. Texas remains well positioned to fully recover from the COVID outbreak and return to its norm of economic growth in excess of the national rate. As is always the case, this estimate is based on the information we have available. It represents our efforts to provide lawmakers with the most accurate information possible as they work to finish the state's budget. But we continue to face heightened uncertainty in the months ahead. It remains unclear, for example, the extent to which the behavioral changes consumers and businesses made as a result of the pandemic will become permanent features of the economic landscape. As I've said since the pandemic started more than a year ago, a few more months of data would be very helpful, and that remains true even today. We will continue to monitor the economic conditions closely. Updates to this estimate remain likely during the legislative interim. And at this time, I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Comptroller Hegar, and thank you to all of our attendees today. My name is Chris Bryan. I'm the Director of Communications and Information Services at the Comptroller's Office. I appreciate you all bearing with us through a few little technical difficulties. It sounds like we had a few little hiccups in the video feed, but the sound was playing well. Those of you who are attending today should feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature of the MS Teams live platform. If the Q&A feature is not already up on your screen right now, you can find it by clicking on the icon of the two small dialog boxes with question marks in them in the upper right portion of your screen. A note for our audience members, you're welcome to ask questions anonymously. We do ask as a courtesy from members of the press and legislative staff, please enter your name and affiliation in the Your Name field, and then just enter your question in the Ask a Question field. Our moderators will be posing those questions to the Comptroller as time permits. Again, feel free to submit questions anonymously, but if you are a member of the press or a legislative staffer, it would be helpful for us if you enter your name and affiliation. We're just we're getting our first questions coming through here. We are going to start with a couple of anonymous questions here, it looks like. The first question that before we kind of go into the Q&A, I would like to ask Comptroller Hegar, if you wouldn't mind just kind of going over some of those headline numbers one more time. There was a lot of numbers that got thrown out there. We had a little bit of technical difficulty. I just want to make sure that everyone who's in attendance right now has those top line numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. The bottom line is that from the January BRE, we moved from $113.88 billion to now it's $115.65 billion. In short, that means the legislature has $3.1 billion more for general purpose spending during this legislative session for the budget, as well as Fund 6, which is transportation fund, as well as the Economic Stabilization Fund or the Rainy Day Fund. Both will get about $550 million more this upcoming biennium than they would in the January revenue estimate. So those are the short line numbers that are extremely important to know. And then the all funds number, state and federal dollars, is $294 billion. So that's pretty much the whole presentation wrapped in the most important numbers that everybody wants to know about.
Thank you. And thank you for summarizing that. I think the first question that came through today is really, and I've seen it a couple of times, but why did you update this estimate?
Yeah, as I said in the January revenue estimate, that obviously a couple more months of data is extremely important. That's a statement that I've been saying since March of last year as we entered into the pandemic with the double headwinds of lower oil and gas prices. I've been scripting out for the last several months that it was clear that we were going to need to revise upward our oil production prices as we have in this revenue estimate, but also you can see that the economy overall is improving, has been in the last 90 days with the vaccine rollout here in the state of Texas, people getting engaged into the economy much more so than have before. And so therefore I've talked about if we were going to provide a revenue estimate update, it would be at the back end of April, the beginning of May, which would enable the legislature to address any issues they may in the state budget before they sine die. So really it's a combination of those factors. The economy is doing better, but then with that being said, as I said earlier in the presentation, and we'll continue to note that there's a lot of issues throughout the rest of the world. Texas is very intertwined to the rest of the global economy. And so as we see case numbers increase in hospitalizations in other countries, while here in Texas, both case count of COVID and hospitalizations have gone down drastically. And so the economy is improving very significantly here in the state of Texas, and felt like it was important and very timely to update the revenue estimate today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the sort of couple more months of data and some of the recent numbers we've seen. The agency put out April revenue numbers just this morning, and we've gotten a couple of questions here asking whether the April numbers are playing a role in this.
Well, we felt as though the April numbers would be up drastically compared to last year already. One, we had started feeling the effects in April collections of last year because of March. March is when businesses started being shut down, closing their doors. People were moving to work, teleworking. And so therefore the impacts of COVID were being felt in economic activity of March of last year. However, I wanted to watch a few days of collections of April collections as we did, an astonishing 31% increase compared to April collections of 2020, or even 19% increase compared to 2019 are very significant increases. Texas has never hit before a $3.4 billion month in sales tax collections, which we just did. So there's a very significant improvement in the economy. But again, part of those dollars are attributed to stimulus checks that people are receiving, as well as some offsetting of dollars that may have come in February were pushed forward into March because unfortunately we had the winter storm and a lot of Texas was shut down for a week. And so yes, part of those numbers did take into account, but we were going to revise upward the revenue estimate already. That decision had been made. We're just trying to get, again, as I keep saying, a couple more weeks of data, a couple more months of data is really important to see what the overall trends are here in the state of Texas. But regardless, it's more optimistic than what everyone thought back in January of this year, which is good for the state economy.
Yeah, you mentioned winter storms for impacting the April revenue numbers. We've had someone ask whether the winter storms impacted this estimate in general.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of Texans were impacted by that storm. The state economy was impacted. Some offsetting of dollars that would have been collected in February economic activity occurred in March economic activity. And so therefore dollars that would have shown up possibly in our March sales tax showed up in our April sales tax numbers. So there is some offsetting. Unfortunately, the economy was impacted undoubtedly by that event. But then there's also a lot of repairs that unfortunately people have had to make to their homes and their businesses because of water damage, and they're spending dollars on repairs that actually shows up in part in our report. So I wouldn't say that in itself as isolated, but that does contribute in part to a little bit healthier activity that we saw in April collections than we would have otherwise.
Okay. Ross Ramsey from the Texas Tribune asks, what has changed the most from your previous estimate and why? And do you think any more change in that area is in order?
I think the most important thing is the vaccine rollout in the state of Texas. Case counts in Texas have gone down, as well as hospitalization here in the state of Texas. And all those things have improved the overall economic outlook than what it was in December of last year and the beginning of January as we were rolling out the biennial revenue estimate. So those factors combined, we did not take into account, even though we felt as though there would be some type of stimulus package out of Washington, D.C., because we look at current law, what the law is at that exact moment. So those stimulus dollars being injected in the economy, people are spending them. Whether you agree or disagree with the stimulus package, the fact is it's probably dragging future GDP forward as people are spending those dollars today. So all of those combination of factors means the state economy is in better shape today than what it was. As back in January, if you recall, case counts were going up with COVID, hospitalizations were going up slightly. So it was a much more cautious outlook than it is today, even though I'm continuing to forecast that we need to be cautious as what may happen in the upcoming months, even though Texas economy looks in much better shape. The fact is there are other parts of the world that are still dealing significantly, unfortunately, with the COVID outbreak there.
Yeah, that's very true, and kind of illustrates how tied we are to the global economy. Along sort of similar lines, you talked in your presentation about oil price and production. I know that was a significant component of what you were looking at as far as a increase. What is the oil price and production assumptions that you were using for this estimate?
So the oil prices that we put into the current revenue estimate, the one we're updating today, has for the first year of the biennium of $60 for oil prices and the second year of the biennium of 62 on WTI. Now, in the January estimate we put out, they were in the low 50s. I mentioned the comments about how the NYMEX future at the time had 95% certainty that oil prices would be somewhere between the low 20s and mid $80 range. Today, it's somewhere between the mid 30s and a little over $100 range. So the point is there's confidence that oil prices are up and will stay up slightly. I think that $60 and $62 range I'm comfortable with those numbers today with that uptick in economic activity that's going on in oil and gas. And then we have overall production at about 4 million barrels a day, slightly increasing to about 4.1 million. So we think it'll increase. We've seen rig activity continue to increase here in the state of Texas, but still a little cautious as to what that overall production volume might be for the next 2 years of the biennium, with a slight uptick over the course of the 2-year biennium.
Okay. That's good information. Bob Garrett of the Dallas Morning News touches on that oil price estimate, and then he has a kind of a follow-up question that I won't go into too much detail for everyone on the phone here today, or on the call here today, but essentially Bob is looking at the all funds number and seeing the increase in that all funds number. I know you talked a little bit about how we treated the federal funds. He says, you know, of the increase that we're seeing there, how much of it was federal funds, and are you including any of the December coronavirus relief package and any of the other sort of relief dollars in that number?
I think the shortest way to try to answer that is, first, the $3.1 billion increase in general purpose spending is a component of $760 million less in state expenses than we originally thought back in January. So while we look at the revenue side, the expense side is important. So that update that we've received from the LBB as well as from other agencies, and then an overall increase in revenues for general purpose spending of about $2.36 billion. And that combines your 3.1. And then for federal dollars, those federal dollars are in that all fund number of $294 billion, both monies that were part of legislation in DC last year as well as the one earlier this year. So those are included in that all fund number.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of related questions here that I'll ask. So we have a question that asks if you have an estimate of how much will be saved by the agency budget cuts and any sort of swaps of federal money for general revenue. And then we sort of have a follow-up question from Clinton Sawyer, who asks if any of these changes or increases in projections affect the decreases mandated to many of the state agency budgets.
So in the numbers today, it does not necessarily include the agency budget cuts, which we think is a little low, just slightly over $790 million, because until the legislature actually takes action, which they are in that process, both in the House and Senate, but until it's finally passed, that's when at least we recognize. Now, we are in constant discussions with legislative leadership, the governor's office, to let them know what we think those cost out numbers and working with state agencies and the legislative budget board, but that's when it gets officially recognized. And then the federal dollars, there's potentially upwards in the $3+ billion, maybe even $3.9 billion that can be utilized. And again, some of those dollars have been incorporated, but others are working through that process right now. So those are not all included in this number, because once the legislature takes action and we know for certain, then we will recognize those two components.
Well, and it's an interesting point because obviously the legislature is in session. They are passing bills. They are making a lot of these decisions right now. And so this, in some respect, there's a little bit of a moving target here. So I know you mentioned that there was a possibility of a revision in the interim. How do you think that the legislature would handle any updates if you update this again after lawmakers are out of session? And if there is a significant revision, would you expect lawmakers to handle that in a special?
Well, I think if you look at the overall state budget that the House and the Senate have passed, that they have now gone to conference and started working on this week, that this announcement that we have today gives them the tools that they need to deal with, say, for example, ERS pensions. There's a bill that's moved out of the Senate that's now over in the House, which is extremely important for the overall credit rating of the state of Texas. That will enable them to be able to deal with that issue, which is an extremely important step from a long-term liability issue in the state of Texas. But I think overall, they really have the tools that they need to be able to keep the promises that they've made in public education last legislative session. And so while we are continuing to monitor the economy, and I continue to repeat today, a year later, that a couple months data is extremely important, because there's a lot more uncertainty in the global economy and the national economy than there have been before. We've never been under a pandemic. And while we're getting glimpses of better outlook of what that economy is going to be, there's still that just uncertainty. And so, you know, I've pledged all along, as we see numbers and data change, we're going to inform the legislature and the public, which what we're doing. And that's why I think that even this fall, there could be adjustments even more. I don't think, at least from a policy standpoint, that would substantially change what the legislature is going to do this legislative session. It would possibly just put them in a better position when they enter back in next legislative session. Also, the state has a very healthy economic stabilization fund, or rainy day fund balance, which under this projection would move that number, if they don't spend any money out of it, which we will see what they do, would be $12.12 billion when we come back 2 years from now. Then, as kind of the question earlier about the federal dollars, those federal dollars, we're still trying to get guidance from the U.S. Treasury as well as other agencies at the federal level, the legislature, to figure out exactly how they're going to put some of those pieces of federal dollars to work. So I think the legislature has plenty of tools to be able to deal with the budget this cycle. It just means that we would have a better position that we start in 2 years from now, which we all hope that would be the case.
Thank you. We do. This next question is a reminder that it's you know, they're differing opinions on probably what the answer will be, but we have someone who asked, would you consider this a conservative estimate?
Well, I think I always caution, when I first gave my very first revenue estimate in January of 2015, I got that question about conservative estimates several times. And I kept pointing out that this estimate is the best one that we can give with all the data that we have. The moving pieces is the most accurate data points that we think we can present to the legislature and to the public. And so, you know, I think it is continuing to be cautious as to what the economic future is here in the coming months. But with that being said, much more optimistic than it was earlier this year. So not saying conservative, not from a political sense, and that's what I would continually guard against, same as I did when I was asked that question again back in 2015, is I don't want that word to be used as though it's a political sense. Really what it is just trying to be cautious as to what the economic outlook, while it's much better than it was in January, just taking into account there are a lot of things that are uncertain, especially as to the global economy. We see significant supply chain issues for various businesses, tightening of the labor force here, as well as inflationary pressures. So all of those different factors that are out in the economy, not just in Texas, the United States, and the world, means that we need to be a little more conservative and or cautious in our economic outlook. We still project economic gains in the state of Texas, economic output. Texas is going to once again go back to the position, if we're not already, of outpacing the national average economically year after year. We're getting back to that point again, which is great for the state of Texas. But with that, yes, I would say I still remain, and my team here, to be cautious and or conservative as to our outlook into the upcoming months.
Okay, thank you. We have a follow-up from Ross. I think, I think there are some folks who are interested in a little bit more information on the sort of federal relief dollars. I know that you sort of talked about a little bit how, we're still getting guidance. We don't have Texas estimates for all these dollars. We don't know exactly what conditions might be applied to some of them. And you've mentioned repeatedly that in your mind, you're not incorporating anything that hasn't been sort of firmly established, signed into law, and that we have some guidance on. Ross sort of asks, does the $294 billion, for example, include the money that the state just released to the school districts?
Yes, it includes that. And so those dollars are included in the all funds. However, again, how the legislature appropriates those dollars or when they can appropriate those dollars, I think is yet to be seen. So of the different buckets of money that have come from the state, those that were last year, as well as the ones in the most recent stimulus package that passed out of DC, those that are flowing through the state treasury, as one of the slides that we showed earlier, about $40 billion, a little subset of that to local, smaller counties and cities that will flow through the state budget. The largest ones receive it directly. Doesn't include stimulus check dollars, businesses dollars. None of those things are in that number. That is purely flowing through the state treasury. And as we all know, there's the public education piece, but there's a whole lot of different buckets of money. And so trying to make sure that we see what that guidance is and know exactly, so we're adhering with federal law as the legislature is appropriating that either this biennium and or in the upcoming months or next legislative session, because some of these dollars, they don't have to be expended immediately. They can be dealt with over time. For example, some of the public education dollars. And so, but in short, yes, we're including what has passed to date in these current all fund projected numbers.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of related questions on the 1115 waiver, and I think the main question that we have is, is the revocation of the 1115 Medicaid waiver included in this? And sort of as a follow-up, are you, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, are you only using current law in your estimates?
Yeah, so we only use current law. At the time of when we provided the biennial revenue estimate in January, that did not take into account an 1115 waiver being granted because it had not been granted at that point. And so therefore the BRE nor the update to the BRE take into an account an 1115 waiver, because in between the two is when it was granted to the state of Texas and then pulled back. So it wasn't in either the BRE or the revision because it had not been granted at that point in time. But I will say overall, it is very disappointing that waiver was pulled back because it does have very significant fiscal costs, especially for rural health Texas, rural areas of the state, as well as uncompensated care. So I'm very concerned about what that means to the state of Texas, and I really hope the administration will do a reverse on that and see the wisdom of making sure that Texas is able to continue to have that waiver. I think it's really important for the state and healthcare in this state.
Thank you. It looks like we have a couple of transportation folks on the call today. We do have a question. With this revision, how much motor vehicle sales tax revenue do you expect to go into the highway fund? I know there's there are a few little quirks about when that money comes in and what the levels are. How much do you expect to go into the highway fund?
Yeah, so we see the full amount going in from the sales tax. We also see, as I kind of mentioned earlier, just to make the point, from the ESF, that transfer in the first year of the biennium being 1.26 billion, the second year being roughly 1.67 billion. Again, that's an upward revision of $550 million to the highway fund from severance tax collections that would have otherwise. We do see a small amount of motor vehicle sales tax per the legislation that passed in the proposition many years ago of about $68 million. So that's been a small amount. It's not really materialized as you have after $5 billion in motor vehicle sales and rental tax collections, then a certain threshold above that. So we only see about $68 million in the upcoming biennium for that portion. But again, sales tax collections and severance tax collections, both the sales tax is going to happen, which it was during the BRE, and now severance tax collections are going to go up by 550 million.
So we have an anonymous question here that comes in that is specific to HB2. This questioner asks, how much more room to spend will the enactment of HB2 provide the legislature? The LBB estimate is 5.7 billion. Do you have any more clarity between this estimate and the revenue available as a result of that HB2 passage?
Yeah, I don't think that really the legislature, if you look at the revenue estimate today, obviously it gives the legislature more flexibility in the passage of the Appropriations Act this session. Both the Supplemental Appropriations Bill, HB2, as well as Senate Bill 1, which is the General Appropriation Act for the next biennium. So having $3.1 billion more in general purpose spending gives the legislature more flexibility to meet the needs of whatever they see fit as they're winding down both Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 2.
Thank you. So let me ask this question, because we've seen this come through a little bit about what you're looking at, and I think you've looked a little bit about this as it regards case counts and some things in other countries. What are you concerned about back here at home? Are you concerned about federal debt or inflation or anything like that? What are those things that you're seeing on the horizon?
Yeah, well, one, again, as I keep repeating, what happens in other countries does have a ripple effect here in the state of Texas from supply chain issues that do have concerns about labor supply and availability, even though unfortunately we still are down roughly 470,000 jobs compared to what we were pre-pandemic here in the state of Texas. So more Texans are still unemployed. We went from having a 3.4% unemployment rate to now we're back down to about 6.9 after we had significant increases, unfortunately, in unemployment last March, April, and May. But with that, I hear from a lot of business owners that supply chain of employees is a little, it's tight out there, and they have concerns about being able to find more employees for what they need for their businesses and for economic activity, as well as inflationary price costs. You see input cost of all commodities have gone up. So those types of things are something that's a concern. There's a lot of built up people that want to get out and engage in the economy, which is good, as we've seen our case counts go down and hospitalization go down. But there's also a tamping effect to some degree on that economic output potential because of some of those constraints.
Thank you, sir. Just a reminder, we're beginning to bump up against our time for this. Please, if you do have any final questions, please be sure to use that Q&A chat feature at the top right of your screen. It's the two dialog bubbles with the question mark in between or in them. We have had a couple of questions. I know you touched on this, and maybe we need to circle back. will the state have enough revenue to pay for the ongoing costs of school finance reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest questions that I had from the legislature members a year ago, as well as many in the public, was that exact question. As we were in this exact in the spot a year ago, as so much uncertainty as what the direction of the economy was going to be. We knew there was a recession. We just didn't know how deep, how wide, how long. People were very concerned. But I think, the economy has been much more resilient than pretty much anybody would have anticipated a year ago, much less even in December of last year and January of this year, which is good for all of us. But so I think, we see that the economy is moving in the right direction. The legislature is able to keep the promises that they so wanted to make sure that they kept in school finance reform when they were here 2 years ago.
Thank you. And then I think we have two couple final questions here that seem to be slightly related. We have somebody who asks, isn't the 115.65 billion in general purpose spending still less than the amount being spent by both the Senate and the House in SB 1? And if so, how will that affect the work of the conference committee? And then we have a kind of clarifying question that I think might go a little bit to answering towards that, which is the 295 billion in all funds money. This person is asking to clarify they are assuming that includes a large amount of unspent federal COVID related funding. Maybe you can kind of touch on both those topics. I think they're somewhat related.
Right. So yes, the first answer, the latter part, is that there are unspent federal dollars that's part of that all funds. So some of that, as we talked about earlier, with the public education dollars that was announced last week by the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker, that a little over $11 billion. There's actually a larger subset of public education money that doesn't have to be spent immediately. And TEA is working with their federal counterpart to try to make sure to figure out whatever the exact guidance is so Texas can actually use those dollars in the public education system. So I just make that as one point, that there are unspent dollars. And then as to the first question, the difference between the gap is, as I said earlier, the $793 million that agencies did not spend per the reduction of 5% over the biennium. That's not taken into account until it's actually passed by the legislature in both chambers, and that's when it's officially recognized. So that's one piece component that will be able to put the legislature in a better position overall, while we're continuing to communicate with them of what we think that number is and what we'll ultimately certify. That's not taken into account, but we continue to talk about it because we know it's out there and it's very real. So that'll complete part of that question of that gap between what they have in the proposed budgets as well as what we're announcing today. And then secondly, the federal dollars, some of those are able to be spent on state expenses, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. So those are two components. Another question is whether they use part of the economic stabilization fund or not. One chamber is using a little bit, the other one is not. And so therefore, the point being is all of those are different components that can actually make sure that they pass the state budget and it all certifies.
Okay. Well, on that extremely wonky note, I think we can bring an end to our discussion today. Thank you, Comptroller Hegar. Thank you for taking the time to walk through a lot of that stuff with us. I know there are a couple of questions that still have not gotten answered. We are going to endeavor to get those questions answered today. We're going to put up a slide here. Thank you, Comptroller Hegar, for your time, and thank you all the audience members who are in attendance today. We really appreciate the comments that we're getting, and some of the stuff that's coming through here is very kind. So thank you. If you didn't get your question answered today, please refer to the slide that's up on your screen right now. Feel free to send us an email. We'll run down any numbers that did not come across clearly on this and provide those to you. All the materials that were used in today's presentation, including the update to the BRE itself, are available on the Comptroller's website. Just go to controller.texas.gov and navigate to our media center. If you need to review the Comptroller's presentation after the closing of this event, you can visit the link for the live event again to review a video of the presentation in its entirety. And we'll also be putting up a full copy of this presentation, and including the Q&A features, and including the Q&A footage onto YouTube. All of that, again, can be found at the Comptroller's Media Center, www.controller.texas.gov. And please navigate to our media center. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all the Comptroller office staff who made this presentation possible today, especially the revenue estimating staff who've been working hard to get this out and ready, and including all of the most recent information possible. This concludes the May 2021 update to the Biennial Revenue Estimate. Thank you all.